This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. My shirt reads, "Well-behaved women seldom make history." Well, I don't know about that, but I'm going to tell you about some women with October birthdays. And some were pretty well behaved and some weren't so well behaved, just like the women that we know. For October 1st, we have Anne Wood, better known as Annie Besant, born on October 1st, 1847, in England. And she was famous in her time, particularly for being involved with a certain kind of philosophy. But it was more than that. She also was involved in India. In fact, she served as the first woman president of the Indian National Congress, which was a group that was working for independence for India from England, actually. Annie Besant. For October 2nd, Elizabeth Thompson Butler. She died on October 2nd in 1933, and she was a painter. Her sister was a famous musician of the time as well, so it was quite an artistic family. She died actually in Ireland, but she was known particularly for her paintings of war scenes during the 19th century. In fact, the very first picture she painted was bought by Queen Victoria herself when Elizabeth Thompson Butler was just a young woman in her 20s. But it showed calling the roll after an engagement, i.e. a battle in the Crimea. And after that, she was so well known for that everyone wanted a picture of a battle scene, so she specialized in battle scenes essentially all her life. But she died in 1933 on October 2nd. For the 3rd of October, Lucy Hobbs. Lucy Hobbs was the first, I guess you might say, registered official dentist. Many people have heard of Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman medical doctor. But Lucy Hobbs was the first established woman dentist. It says she died in 1910, and she was almost 80 years old at the time. But she and also her husband, who was also a dentist, were very well-known people in their field, especially in Kansas, where they lived during the 19th century. She was associated with Ohio. She tried to get into the Ohio Dental College, but they would not admit her at first because of the fact that she was female. And so she apprenticed to a dentist and learned the trade, and later did go to the dental school in Ohio. And so Lucy Hobbs, the first woman dentist in the United States, and a person associated with our own state of Ohio. That was on October 3rd. For October 4th, we don't have a picture, actually. We couldn't find a picture of Sophia Alexeyevna, who was the sister of Peter the Great of Russia. She was older than Peter, who was her half-brother, actually. And she after her parents' death, she sort of helped raise him till he was old enough and became a co-czar with another brother. The other co-czar happened to die. So Peter went on to become Peter the Great himself of Russia. Sophia Alexeyevna, born in 1657 on October 4th, baptized in Moscow. For the 5th of October, we have two people. The first is Sylvia Beach. This is actually a death day. Sylvia Beach died at 74 in Paris in 1962. This shows her surrounded by books, and that makes sense because she was the owner of a bookstore in Paris, which was frequented by many famous authors who were popular during the 1920s and 1930s, including among her customers James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, André Gide, Paul Valéry, Gertrude Stein, Samuel Beckett, Tom Wolfe, Thornton Wilder, Christopher Isherwood, Ford Madox Ford, E.M. Forster, Catherine Ann Porter, Elizabeth Bishop, Sherwood Anderson, Stephen Vincent Benet, and Ernest Hemingway, which sounds like a roll call of the famous authors of the 1920s and 30s, the people that I grew up reading when I was a young person long ago. But Sylvia Beach owned this bookstore in Paris, and all these people who came to Paris after the First World War hung out at her bookstore and bought books there and met friends there and so on. So that's Sylvia Beach. She died at age 74 in Paris in 1962. She stayed in Paris all during World War II when it was occupied by the Germans and so on. She was an American, but she really became a Frenchwoman, you might say. For October 6th, we have Jenny Lind. Jenny Lind was the most famous singer, probably, of the 19th century. She was Swedish, born in Sweden in 1820, and she became famous internationally. She sang in the U.S., but she was, of course, originally from Europe, and she did much of her traveling to sing for people in Europe during the middle of the 19th century. But she was well known, and the composer Felix Mendelssohn, who was a famous 19th century composer, claimed that no one as gifted as she would be born in the 19th century to match her beautiful singing voice. She came to the United States. In fact, she was backed by P.T. Barnum, the fellow who was famous for circuses. But he was a showman, of course, and he was in the business of putting people who were show people on the stage. And when she came to the U.S., he was the person. In fact, he got really wealthy by setting her up for her trips in the United States. he earned almost over $700,000, which in the 19th century was a tremendous fortune. P.T. Barnum, earned for putting Jenny Lind on the not on the circus circuit, but on the show circuit when she came to the United States. In the 7th of October, we have a woman called Isabella Bird Bishop. That's actually a death date, October 7th. She died in Scotland in the year 1904, and she was a world-famous traveler. She went all over, and she was particularly fond of traveling in the United States. And the Rocky Mountains were a favorite haunt. She had a sidekick who was a Rocky Mountain guide named Mountain Jim. And she wrote a book called A Lady's Life in the Rockies. But unfortunately, Mountain Jim died in a gunfight in 1874. Now, one of the odd things about Isabella Bird Bishop was that if she was at home, just sitting around or, doing ordinary everyday things at home, she often got sick. Whereas when she was on the trips, she was noted for her liveliness and her mountain climbing, actually. She went all over the world, Australia, the Far East, Latin America, climbing peaks, especially peaks that hadn't been climbed or hadn't been climbed by a woman, so that she became very well known for her mountain climbing skills. It says that when she was 63 years old, she made a 3,000-mile tour, not only in the Far East, but Canada. And she took a long 1,000-mile trip when she was in her 60s across Morocco, which, of course, the southern part of Morocco, where she took this 1,000-mile trip, was desert country, essentially the Sahara. For October 8th, we have a woman called Claude Cogan. Claude Cogan was another one of those people who liked to go places where people hadn't been before. And as a matter of fact, she died on October 8th in 1959. Now, they don't know exactly when she actually passed away, because she and her guide died in a blizzard in Nepal in 1959, and so it was after the blizzards had stopped and so on, and people were able to look and find her camp and discover that it was destroyed, had been destroyed. I guess they maybe didn't even find her body. But she was quite a mountain climber, and her camp was found at 23,000 feet on this mountain in Nepal. For October 9th, we have a woman who was well known, especially on the radio, when I was young. Her name, Aimee Semple McPherson, and she was a noted faith leader who traveled the country giving speeches about her Christian faith. Aimee Semple McPherson one of the things that's remembered of her, because it turned out to be so odd, sort of, was that she disappeared. And that was, I think, in 1929. By then, she was quite wealthy, quite well known. She'd been traveling in the United States, giving talks for some time, and had become quite a wealthy person. But I guess it was 1926. People always felt that she had told a story about being kidnapped because she was tired of being in the public eye, and so she just sort of disappeared for a while, a couple of weeks or something like that. And people didn't know what had become of her, and finally she reemerged and said, "Here I am, I'm back again." Aimee Semple McPherson. Some people think that she actually ran away with a fellow and then thought better of it later. But it was for a couple of weeks, everyone was wondering what the heck could have happened to Ms. McPherson. And she had disappeared while swimming, but her body was not found, obviously, because she hadn't drowned, as it turned out. Anyway, she had a big temple. Well, she called it a temple. It was called a temple on the radio when I was young, that she broadcast from, and that was in Los Angeles. It was called Angelus Temple. And so she was quite a radio personality in the 1940s when I was a young person. For October 10th, we have Helene Rosenbach Deutsch. Deutsch was her married name, Helene Deutsch, and she was from Austria-Hungary, but in the part of Austria-Hungary that later became a part of Poland. And Helene Deutsch was quite an organizer. Actually, she ran away as a teenager and married or I guess maybe she didn't marry, a married radical organizer and socialist. And she was smuggling propaganda and handing out propaganda, throwing herself in front of the militia's horses. It says she wanted to be arrested but never was, Helene Deutsch. But she became a psychiatrist, a specialist in psychiatry. In fact, she was the first woman who was actually psychoanalyzed by Sigmund Freud, the famous inventor of psychiatry. And she wrote a 2-volume work, a book called The Psychology of Women. But it says that she popularized Freud's theory of women, which was that normal women were passive, self-sacrificing, masochistic. Well, any woman out there can see if you fit that, whether you fit that description of the normal woman. And at any rate, that's what Helene Deutsch popularized as the normal state of women, and she herself had been psychoanalyzed by Sigmund Freud. For the 10th of October, we have a woman called Gertrudis Bocanegra. Bocanegra was a Mexican woman, and she was involved in the Mexican rebellion against Spain that broke out in 1810. And the Mexicans, many of whom, of course, were descendants of Spaniards, decided they wanted independence. They wanted to be free from Spain, and Bocanegra was among the rebels in Mexico against Spanish rule. She was eventually arrested by the Spaniards in charge in Mexico, and she was executed by them. So I guess this was actually her death day at age 52, Gertrudis Bocanegra, in the year 1817, when the Spaniards finally executed her for having been among the people who led the fight against the Spanish rule in Mexico. Executed on October 10th, 1817. October 11th is the birth date, and this is a birth date, of a famous American woman that I remember vividly from my childhood. Her name, Eleanor Roosevelt. She was born Eleanor Roosevelt, and when she was about 20 years old, she married her fifth cousin, whose name was also Roosevelt. She married Franklin D. Roosevelt. I was born in New York State in 1932, when Franklin D. Roosevelt was the governor of New York, and later that year ran for president and was elected president, becoming president on March 4th, 1933. Franklin Roosevelt was the last president to be inaugurated in March, and they've since moved the date back to January 20th, of course. Mrs. Roosevelt was a person who did a lot of traveling. It's probably well known even by folks today that Franklin Roosevelt had been crippled by polio and could not walk except with the aid of braces and crutches, and spent a lot of time in a wheelchair, actually. Mrs. Roosevelt did a lot of traveling and a lot of politicking for her husband, Franklin Roosevelt. She was a very memorable person. After his death, he died in office, you know. He was the only president who served more than 2 terms. In fact, after his death, they passed a constitutional amendment limiting presidents to 2 terms. Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected 4 times President of the United States, and he died in office shortly after he had been inaugurated for the 4th time. He died April 12th, 1945, which is a date that I remember because we were called to the big room, you know, in the school, you know, unexpectedly on April 12th, 1945. No one knew why. And it was because President Roosevelt had died. He died at his Warm Springs, Georgia home, where he had often gone to find the healing waters there in Hot Springs, Georgia, which helped him with his lameness due to having had polio in his 20s. So she kept on after his death, and she was named as the American head of the mission to the United Nations. She had participated in the setting up of the United Nations, the writing of the United Nations Charter, which occurred, actually was going on starting in April of 1945 in San Francisco. And Mrs. Roosevelt, after the death of her husband, was there helping to set up the United Nations, to which she served as the U.S. delegate for a number of years. And she wrote a column called My Day, which was in the newspapers around the United States when I was a girl. And I used to read her column, My Day, in which she talked about things that she had done, places she had been, people she had met, famous people she had met, activities she had been involved in, especially for women and for the United Nations. She lived on into the 1950s. Eleanor Roosevelt, born on October 11th in 1884. For the 12th of October, we have a woman called Edith Cavell. And this shows her as a Red Cross nurse in Europe during World War I. Now, Cavell was denounced as a helper of the Allies. She was living in Brussels in occupied Belgium during World War I, which had been occupied by the Germans. And she was a Red Cross nurse. But it was said that she was helping Allied people, that is to say, people allied with the English and then later on with the Americans who opposed the Germans. So she was, this was her death day, October 12th, 1915, when she was executed in Brussels for aiding the Allies and opposing the Germans who were occupying Belgium. Edith Cavell, a nurse. She died before the firing squad, as says they interviewed her for 4 minutes and then they shot her. For October 13th, we have a famous contemporary English woman, Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister for a number of years. First woman Prime Minister in England, of course. She was born Margaret Roberts in Lincolnshire in 1925 on October 13th. And she had become a scientist. She'd been trained as a chemist, and she worked in chemistry, but then she went into politics. And although she said in something like in 1974, she said something like it'd be a long time before there were any women who were head of the party, one of the political parties or prime minister, and yet the following year she became head of the conservative parties, the Tory party in England, 1975, and a couple of years later, the Prime Minister of England as head of the conservative Tory party in England, born in 1925. And she was a forthright woman. It says in the book that at age 9 she won a prize in school for something or other, and she said, "I wasn't lucky, I earned it." So she was a person who was quite aware of her talents, and that was at age 9. She certainly grew up to be someone who knew who she was and who led people politically. October 14th is the birthday of an Ohio woman born in Springfield, Ohio in 1896, Lillian Gish. Lillian Gish was a well-known actress in the 19 teens and 20s, and she was still around, of course, although considerably older since she was born in 1896. I knew of her when she was in her 40s and 50s. She was a well-known movie and stage personality, Lillian Gish. And she and her daughter, her sister, she had a sister named Dorothy Gish, were both of them on the stage and screen. And as a matter of fact, because their father died when they were young, their mother had them go right to work on the stage and later screen, earning money for the family. So she met a woman, she saw a woman that she had remembered who from back in Ohio, but this woman had become a famous actress, namely Mary Pickford. So Mary Pickford actually helped the Gishes join in becoming show people. So it says that she made 20 films in her first couple of years, and those I think were all silent films. They were back in the day, talkies only came in 1927. So she'd gotten her start, 10, 15 years earlier, actually, Lillian Gish and her sister Dorothy. But it's said that at one point she was playing Camille. Camille was the name of a famous play that was done a lot back in the early teens of the last century. And it was about a woman who died of consumption, i.e. tuberculosis, which was a very bad and all too frequent illness back in the days before there was any real way of curing consumption or tuberculosis, before there was some medicine to prevent tuberculosis. But she was going to play this role as Camille, so she sort of starved herself for a couple of days so that she really looked like she was on her last legs for the filming of Camille. In fact, she expired so naturally that the director ran over to see if she was actually deceased. But she wasn't. She was just playing very well and had starved herself enough that she felt quite ill and was very believable in that death scene for Camille. October 15th was the death date in 1917 of a woman noted as a infamous spy. In fact, she claimed to be a double agent, that she worked for both the English and the Germans in the First World War. Her name was Mata Hari. That was not her given name, but I guess a Malay name or a name from the Far East that she had taken. Her name being actually Zella, her last name being Zella, and she was born in the Netherlands, but she was executed by the Germans as a spy on October 15th, 1917. and known to history as Mata Hari. For the 16th of October, we remember Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was the last queen of France. And this shows her all dressed up as the Queen of France. She was one of the many children of the Empress Maria Theresa, who was the Empress of Austria-Hungary. In fact, I think she was the youngest daughter of Maria Theresa, and she married the young man who became King of France. And they reigned for a number of years, but the French Revolution occurred in 1789, as you may recall from history, and the French became a republic of sorts. Of course, it was later taken over in the late 1790s by Napoleon himself. But Marie Antoinette was the last queen of France, and in fact, her husband was guillotined, which was the what they considered to be a humane way of executing people. The guillotine, of course, famous for cutting off people's heads, was considered a humane instrument of execution. Her husband died in early 1793, and Marie Antoinette herself was guillotined on October 16th, 1793 in Paris. And this shows her, of course, as a Queen of France, which she was until 1789, when the French Revolution took place. For the 17th of October, for the 17th of October, we have Sophia Gregoria Haydn, born in Chile in 1868. She was the first, you might say, professional woman architect. She was the first woman who got a degree from MIT in architecture, and that was in the 1880s. Well, in 1891, they were planning a big show that was going to be put on in Chicago, a World's Fair, for the 500th anniversary of the, quote, discovery of America in 1892 by Christopher Columbus. So they were putting up a lot of buildings in Chicago, and it was decided that it would really be a good idea if they could find a woman architect to design the Women's Pavilion at the Chicago World's Fair of 1892. So sure enough, here was Sophia Gregoria Haydn, an official graduate architect, and she was the designer and oversaw the construction of the women's building at the 1892 World's Fair held in Chicago. Actually, this was the one and only building she ever really got a big commission for, and her commission was not that large. It says that she got $1,500, which sounds like quite a bit. However, the men architects who designed the other buildings all started it at about $3,000 and went up from there. So even in that day, they were not playing fair with the women. Ms. Hayden got the chance to build the women's building at the World Fair in 1892 in Chicago, but she only got about a third of what the men got for who put up other buildings for that fair. For October 18th, we have Margaret Carolyn Anderson. This is actually a death day in 1973, and she had been a writer and an editor of a little magazine called The Little Review, which was founded in 1914, many years, of course, before her death. She edited The Little Review, and she published all these famous people from the early teens of the last century and the 20s, so on, including Vachel Lindsay, Gertrude Stein, Ernest Hemingway, Hilda Doolittle, Carl Sandburg, Ben Hecht, Sherwood Anderson, William Carlos Williams, Amy Lowell, Ford Madox Ford, Wallace Stevens, Malcolm Cowley, Ezra Pound, William Butler Yeats, T.S. Eliot, and Hart Crane. And they were all people who published in The Little Review, which was edited by Margaret Carolyn Anderson back in the 1920s of the last century. It says that she published articles by Emma Goldman, who was a famous anarchist, and the U.S. Post Office didn't like that very well. And not only the U.S. Post Office, I guess they didn't actually move against her for that, but her biggest financial backer took his money and went home after she published Emma Goldman, the famous anarchist woman. And she serialized Ulysses by James Joyce. Now there's where the post office got involved. The post office didn't like the fact that Ulysses was considered, had been banned in Boston and several other places as being an immoral book. So it resulted in trial for obscenity, actually, and the U.S. Post Office seized some of those copies that Joyce had published for the editor, Margaret Carolyn Anderson, editor of The Little Review. On October 19th, Annie Smith Peck was born in Providence, Rhode Island in the year 1850. Miss Peck was one of the first women who became a college professor in the 19th century. And I mean, as a female, you know, she was one of the first female college professors. She was a well-known mountain climber, and she climbed the Matterhorn in Switzerland, which well, the scandalous thing about it, most people thought, was that she put on pants to do it. Of course, this was like 1880 or something like that, and when women were wearing very long skirts and multiple underwear. So in order to climb a good mountain and get up there in good shape, she very wisely put on pants, but that was quite scandalous for the time. She found one mountain that hadn't been climbed yet. It was in the Andes, And she went up there to the top. It hadn't been climbed yet by a man, hadn't been climbed by anyone, but it was like 23,000 feet high. And in 1904, she climbed that mountain, Huascan, I guess it says, Huascaran, Mount Huascaran, a double-edged giant. And she tried it for a long, long time. She climbed. She made 6 attempts, it says, and 5 times she didn't make it to the top because of bad weather or her guide got sick or something happened to stop her. But eventually, on the 6th climb, she managed to climb Mount Huascaran in Peru. And I guess it was actually 1909 that she actually got to the top of that one. Now, the 20th of October, we remember Lydia Maria Child. That was her death date at age 72 in Massachusetts, and that was in 1880. Lydia Maria Child was a famous author of the 19th century. She was born in 1808, so she saw most of the 19th century. And she wrote books, and including children's books. She wrote a book called The Frugal Housewife, tips to women on how to save money when you're a housewife and have to buy the food and cook the food and so on. It says that her book called The Frugal Housewife went through 33 editions between 1829 and 1870. So it was something that many, many women in the 19th century read in order to get tips on how to be good, thrifty housewives. She also became involved with anti-slavery efforts. In fact, she sort of gave up on writing things like The Frugal Housewife, just raked in the profits from that, and turned her attention to opposing slavery, working for the abolition of American slavery, which of course was very much a part of the 19th century America. And she also wrote asking for help and better treatment of American Indians. So Lydia Maria Child was, I might say, a philanthropist as an author. For October 21st, we have Lady Jane Grey, born in Leicestershire, England, in 1537. Now, the exact date is not known. I guess this, which is absolutely identifies Lady Jane Grey, born in the 16th century, but not knowing exactly when this was. Her family was very interested in getting her married to married to the King of England, in fact. Well, Henry VIII had a son who became Edward VI, and who was the brother of Mary I and also Elizabeth I. And they tried to, her family, the family of Lady Jane Grey, tried to get her married off to Edward VI, but that didn't work. So then they did get her married off to the Duke of Northumberland, and he was the power behind the throne, apparently. She didn't want to, but it says that they persuaded her with nips, pinches, and pinches and blows to marry the Duke of Northumberland. Well, after the death of Edward VI, not only that, but the fall of the Duke of Northumberland from grace, he was actually executed by Mary, who became Queen of England on the death of Edward VI. And of course, then later, her sister Elizabeth reigned for 45 years in England. But she was Queen Jane for all of 9 days, and then Mary took over and had to get rid of the people who had tried to, quote, seize the throne. And so Lady Jane Grey herself was executed on February 12th, 1554. So she went dignified and not weeping to the block. October 22nd is the death date of a woman who was a famous teacher, famous music teacher. I remember hearing her speak long ago. Her name, Nadia Boulanger. This was a death date. She died at 92 in 1979. Well, of course, when I saw her, it must have been about 50 years earlier. She had a long, very fruitful life as a teacher of many students. It was said finally that practically every school of music in the United States had a person who had been a student of Nadia Boulanger, who finally died in 1979 on October the 22nd at age 92. For October 23rd, we have Gertrude Ederle. This was a birth date. She was born in New York City in the year 1906. Gertrude Ederle, a famous swimmer. So we have a picture of her in her natural environment with a swimming cap on and busily swimming. She set a record in crossing the English Channel. It says that it took her 13 hours to cross the English Channel. That sounds like a lot of time, and it was a lot of time, but the English Channel is what, 20 miles wide or something like that. And she actually beat the men's time by 2 hours. Gertrude Ederle, the famous swimmer. She was born in 1906, and she had won Olympics medals in the year 1924 and 25. And it was in 1926. Actually, it says it was 35 miles she had to swim to cover 21-mile distance, because she wasn't able to swim, straight across at the narrowest point for whatever reason. But she still beat the men's world record for swimming the English Channel in 14 hours and 31 minutes, it says, almost 2 hours faster than the men's world record. Gertrude Ederle. For October 24th, we have Sarah Jane Hale. Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. Well, everyone memorized that when I was a little girl. I suppose they don't anymore, but Sarah Jane Hale was the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb, and she was an author of many other works, but this is the one that has come down to history associated with Sarah Hale. She founded a ladies' magazine, which later joined Godey's Ladies Book, and she worked in that magazine, with that magazine as an editor and so on. So, next we have Grace O'Malley, born in 1530, they think, and she was a pirate. She fought for the Irish against the English way back then in the 1600s, the 16th century, 1577. For the 26th of October, Hillary Rodham Clinton, that's her birthday. So we remember Mrs. Clinton on October 26th. Also born on October 26th was Burl Markham, who wrote this book called West with the Night. She became a pilot and she flew. She was the first woman to fly from east to the west. She flew from Africa to North America. And then she wrote this book called West with the Night, which is a really wonderful book. You ought to look it up and give it a read. The 27th, Maxine Hong Kingston, who is a famous author, still right today, Chinese-American woman. On the 28th of October, Nawal el-Saadawi, born in Egypt, and I heard her speak here at Ohio University a couple of years ago. Also for 28th, I'm not sure why, they have added Sappho, born on Lesbos, and the most famous lesbian woman from 7th century BC. The 29th, Fanny Brice, who was a comedian, and I used to hear her on the radio. Her favorite character, my favorite character for hearing her, was Baby Snooks, who was on the radio, very funny, Fanny Brice. Ruth Gordon for October 30th, and she's been a well-known actress. For the 31st, Natalie Clifford Barney, born in Dayton, Ohio in 1876. But it says she was a real active, aggressive lesbian. Natalie Barney, a real Ohio woman. And there we have our October birthdays. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.